During the church audit, the accountant held up my husband's canceled check and asked why it had paid my younger sister's rent. The copy trembled between her fingers. A paper fan stopped halfway across Mother Alma's face. The light above the finance table gave one dry click. My tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, but no words came. The check was for $1,200. The memo line read, "April rent for Rochelle." 3 days later, the church had reimbursed my husband from the pastor's discretionary outreach account. Across the fellowship hall, Malcolm sat beside the trustees with his navy suit buttoned and his reading glasses folded on the table. He did not look frightened. He looked offended that anyone had mistaken his generosity for something that required explanation. That expression cost me more than the check, because I had seen it before. Whenever a question reached the edge of his authority, Malcolm wore surprise as if the question itself were the betrayal. The accountant, Sister Elaine Porter, placed the check beside 6 other payments. "Mrs. Reed," she said carefully, "did you know your husband had been paying your sister's housing expenses?" I looked at Rochelle, seated near the kitchen doors in her white hospitality uniform. She lowered her eyes, and that was the moment. The audit stopped being about numbers. I was 44 years old and had been married to Malcolm Reed for 13 years. We arrived at New Day Missionary Baptist as adults, carrying private exhaustion and public manners. I came first. After years of caring for my father, I entered New Day one Wednesday because I had forgotten what it felt like to sit somewhere without being needed. Sister Odessa Green made room beside her without asking what had broken. New Day became the place where I learned that rest could be holy. Malcolm joined 6 months later. He was a commercial insurance manager with a calm voice and a gift for remembering what people said when they thought no one important was listening. The church admired that quality, so did I. We married after 2 years. By our 5th anniversary, Malcolm chaired the trustees and later oversaw contracts, emergency assistance, and the pastor's discretionary account. I coordinated the senior meal ministry, where women measured generosity in foil pans, grocery cards, bus rides, and time. Malcolm called our work the tender side of stewardship. He called his work the side that keeps tenderness funded. My deepest desire in marriage was not to be admired. I wanted to be believed. I wanted to raise a concern without first proving I was calm enough, spiritual enough, and grateful enough to deserve an answer. Malcolm rarely refused me directly. He delayed. He reframed. He reminded me how much pressure leaders carried. When I asked why he controlled every household account, he said duplication created confusion. When I asked why he knew details from women's ministry conversations I had never shared, he said church walls were thin. When I asked why Rochelle called him before she called me, he smiled and said, "Some people come to the person they think can solve the problem." I heard pride in that sentence. I did not yet hear the warning. Manipulation can remain invisible when each incident is judged separately. Rochelle was 7 years younger than I was. She joined New Day after her divorce and became hospitality chair within a year. She could organize a repast for 200 people without raising her voice. She also knew how to make dependence look temporary. "I just need a little help until the custody schedule settles," she would say. I helped with groceries, and the church paid 1 electric bill through benevolence. Then Rochelle stopped asking me. Her rent stayed current. Her car was repaired. Her daughter attended the church's summer arts program without a balance. When I asked how she was managing, she said, "The Lord has been making ways." Faith language can be sincere. It can also be used to close a door before questions enter. Around that same time, Malcolm began knowing things I had told Rochelle in confidence. He knew I had considered stepping down from senior meal ministry because he criticized the time it took. He knew I had asked Sister Elaine whether spouses should serve on connected financial committees. He knew I had told Rochelle I felt lonely in a marriage where every disagreement became a lesson on my attitude. Each time he claimed he had guessed. Each time, Rochelle said I was becoming suspicious because I was tired. I stayed quiet because I had no proof, and because women who question a respected man are often examined more closely than the man they question. Was I jealous of my sister? Was I threatened by Malcolm's leadership? Was caregiving grief making me mistrustful? So I called my silence patience. That was the first lie I had to correct. Patience waits for something honest to grow. Fear waits for permission to name what is already there. The audit began because a roof repair invoice appeared twice in the church records. Pastor Samuel Cross did not accuse anyone. He asked for an independent review before the annual business meeting. Malcolm supported the decision immediately. "Transparency protects everybody," he said from the pulpit. The congregation nodded. He knew how to stand beside a principle as if standing beside it proved he had obeyed it. Sister Elaine Porter led the review. She was a retired municipal auditor, a widow, and the kind of woman who never raised her voice because facts did not need volume. She asked for bank statements, canceled checks, reimbursement forms, vendor invoices, and benevolence approvals from the previous 3 years. At first, the irregularities looked unrelated. Personal checks from Malcolm paid Sister Yvette's utility bill, Denise Harper's son's college deposit, and Mother Alma's property tax shortage. Each was later reimbursed under a different ministry label. Malcolm paid first, then the church repaid Malcolm. He had placed himself between the institution and the women it served. At the first audit meeting, trustees called it an untidy but compassionate system because the money had reached real needs. A useful outcome did not make the method harmless. A controlling favor can still keep the lights on. A compromised gift can still pay rent. That is why women sometimes struggle to name what a favor cost them. The institution wanted the issue to remain procedural. Elaine did not allow it. "Why did every reimbursement require Mr. Reed to become the private benefactor first?" she asked. No one answered. Then she requested interviews with every recipient. The truth began moving from woman to woman, like water passing from one bowl to the next. Once it had started, no single hand could gather it back. Sister Yvette met me in the women's ministry room after choir rehearsal. She closed the door and placed both palms on the long table. "Malcolm paid my electric bill the week before the trustee election," she said. "He told me not to repay him. Then he asked whether you supported Elaine for finance chair. I told him you respected her." Yvette's eyes filled, but she did not cry. "I voted for him because I thought gratitude required it." 2 days later, Denise Harper found me in the church kitchen while I labeled meals for homebound seniors. Malcolm had paid her son's college deposit after she confessed during pastoral counseling that she could not afford it. "He never asked for money back," she said. "He asked me to correct people when they said you carried too much responsibility at home. He told me a good wife protects a husband's public strength." Denise had repeated that sentence to me at a women's breakfast. Now she covered her mouth when she remembered. "I helped him discipline you with something he bought from me," she whispered. The third woman was Mother Alma. She waited on the garden bench after Sunday service, a burgundy hat resting in her lap. Malcolm had paid her property tax shortage after she questioned a building contract. A week later, he asked her to tell the church mothers that the contract concern had been resolved. "I did not lie," she said. "But I spoke with more certainty than I had. I thought accepting help meant I owed him peace." She looked toward the stained glass doors. "A gift that requires your voice afterward is not a gift. It is an agreement nobody let you read." That was the second truth I had to accept. Malcolm did not simply misuse church money. He turned assistance into access. He learned who was frightened, who was ashamed, who needed quick help, and who could be made to feel indebted. Then he used private relief to shape public loyalty. The women were not foolish. They were in need. Need should never become a doorway for power without consent. The trustees resisted for 3 weeks. They said no recipient had complained before the audit. They said Malcolm had not kept the money. They said exposing the system could embarrass women who had already suffered. That last argument sounded merciful until Elaine answered it. Confidentiality protects people from gossip. It does not protect a leader from accountability. Pastor Cross appointed a temporary review committee of 5 people, 3 of them women who had never served under Malcolm's financial authority. I was not placed on the committee. At first, I felt dismissed. Then Elaine explained, "You deserve to be heard as his wife, not burdened with proving the case against him." Women are often asked to investigate the very harm they are still absorbing. Being excluded from power is one wound. Being made responsible for cleaning up power's damage is another. The committee found 19 personal payments reimbursed by the church, and 11 recipients described a request or private question that followed the assistance. Some requests were ordinary, but 6 involved information, votes, or public defense of Malcolm. 4 involved me. He had asked women what I said in private, whether I planned to challenge financial procedures, and whether I had discussed separation. Rochelle's name appeared more than any other. Her rent had been paid 7 times in 18 months. Her car insurance had been paid twice. Her daughter's program fees had been covered through a reimbursement form Malcolm signed himself. Rochelle refused 2 interview requests. At church, she avoided being alone with me. I wanted to force the truth from her. Instead, I remembered something our women's Bible teacher once said about Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Guarding your heart does not mean building a prison around it. It means deciding what has permission to shape your life. I could not control when Rochelle spoke. I could decide that her silence would no longer shape what I knew about myself. I opened a bank account in my own name. I requested copies of our household tax records. I gave Pastor Cross a written statement describing Malcolm's financial control at home and the private information he had obtained through women he assisted. Dignity returned quietly. Not as triumph, as paperwork, boundaries, and the refusal to keep asking a closed door to become kind. Rochelle finally asked to meet in the fellowship hall on a Tuesday afternoon. The room smelled of coffee. Purple irises from Sunday leaned toward the window, their petals beginning to open. She sat across from me, twisting the hospitality badge clipped to her blouse. I did tell him things, she said. How long? Almost 2 years. The answer did not strike like thunder. It settled like dark water. Rochelle said Malcolm first paid her rent when an eviction notice arrived. He told her not to tell me because I already carried too much. Then he began asking ordinary questions. Was I sleeping well, questioning the household accounts, or talking to Elaine about church finances? He made it sound like he was trying to protect your marriage, Rochelle said. And when did you know he was using you? When he paid the 3rd month before I asked. She looked at me then. I knew the money had become a leash. I kept taking it because I was afraid of losing my apartment, and because part of me liked being the sister he trusted more. There it was. Not romance. Not innocence. A private alliance built from need, rivalry, and a man's appetite for control. Rochelle admitted she had warned Malcolm that I planned to request joint access to our accounts. She had told him I was considering separation. She had repeated my fear that the church would believe him before it believed me. What did he say to that? He said the church usually believes the person who keeps it running. My chest tightened, but my voice remained steady. Why are you telling me now? Because Elaine showed me the reimbursement records. I thought he was helping me with his own money. He made the church pay him back. Rochelle had accepted secret help. She had also been deceived about its source. Both truths belonged in the room. I am not ready to trust you, I said. But I will not pretend your need made you deserve to be used. She nodded. I will speak at the business meeting. That was not reconciliation. It was the first honest thing we had built in 2 years. The quarterly church business meeting filled the fellowship hall with trustees, church mothers, ministry leaders, and choir members still carrying music folders. Sister Elaine projected the audit summary onto the wall. She explained the duplicate roof invoice, the personal payments, the reimbursements, and the absence of independent approvals. Then she placed the canceled check beneath the document camera. Malcolm Reed, $1,200, April rent for Rochelle. This was the first time the entire pattern stood around the check. The check was no longer an isolated act of brotherly kindness. It was the clearest stone beneath the surface. Elaine showed the reimbursement, 6 additional rent payments, and the interview notes. Then Rochelle stood. Her voice shook once and settled. She told the congregation Malcolm had paid her rent while asking for private information about his wife. She told them she had participated because she was afraid, ashamed, and resentful. She told them she had believed the money was his. I betrayed my sister's confidence, she said, and Deacon Reed used church assistants to purchase access to it. No one shouted. A choir folder slid slowly from a young woman's knees and rested against her shoe. Malcolm asked to respond. He said every payment met a genuine need and no woman had been threatened. Pastor Cross asked, "Did you ask recipients for information about your wife?" "I asked people who cared about us to help me understand what was happening in my marriage." That sentence revealed more than denial would have. He believed concern gave him the right to build a private network around me and treat my inner life as a management problem. I stood only when Pastor Cross invited me. "For years, Malcolm told me my concerns were confusion," I said. "This audit shows that the confusion was useful to him. He used women's need to gather information, shape votes, and control what the church believed about our marriage." I looked at the women whose bills had been paid. They are not the defendants in this room. Need is not misconduct. The misconduct belongs to the person who attached invisible conditions to help. Then I turned toward Malcolm. "I will not discuss our marriage privately today. You have used private rooms to make truth smaller. My decisions will be made with counsel, records, and boundaries." For the first time, his composure broke into disbelief that I had stepped outside the conversation he controlled. The church voted to remove him immediately as trustee chair and suspend him from every financial and leadership role for 1 year. A congregational panel would decide whether he could return after restitution, ethics training, and a full review of the building contracts. The vote divided New Day. Some members called the punishment severe because Malcolm had not pocketed the money. Others answered that power can steal more than cash. Malcolm left the meeting through the kitchen hallway. No one applauded, and consequence did not need celebration to be real. The months after the audit were not tidy. Malcolm moved out while our separation was arranged. I did not meet with him alone. Practical conversations happened with counsel present. He wrote one letter saying he had only tried to hold the marriage together. I returned it unread through counsel. Not every explanation deserves entrance simply because it arrives politely. New Day rebuilt its benevolence process. No leader could pay a bill personally and request reimbursement. 2 unrelated reviewers approved emergency help, and written policy stated that assistance created no obligation to volunteer, vote, provide information, or defend a leader. Healing that changes, no structure leaves the next vulnerable person standing in the same doorway. The women cared for one another in concrete ways. Elaine helped Rochelle build a housing budget. Mother Alma sat beside me during mediation and wrote down my questions. Denise organized a confidential support circle for assistance recipients. Sister Yvette took over meal deliveries when I needed distance. The church mothers refused fellowship hall gossip. When someone called the recipients Malcolm's women, Mother Alma corrected her. They were members in need. Do not turn his method into their identity. Rochelle and I did not return to our former closeness. Trust grew only through small, observable choices. She stopped asking me to comfort her and accepted that forgiveness did not restore access on demand. 6 months later, she gave the review every message Malcolm had sent her. I read no more than the process required. I had spent too many years believing knowledge meant safety. Sometimes safety comes from knowing enough to set a boundary and refusing to make pain your permanent occupation. The panel confirmed misuse of reimbursements, conflicts of interest, and coercive leadership. Malcolm repaid the funds, and the church did not restore him to office. He remained free to worship, but he was no longer free to lead. That distinction taught New Day something important about grace. Grace does not erase consequence. It makes repentance possible without making authority automatic. I remained at the church that had been both refuge and the room where my marriage was examined. One Thursday, sunlight crossed the fellowship hall tables while the meal team worked without whispering or waiting for Malcolm's approval. I understood that leaving is not the only form of freedom. Sometimes, freedom is remaining without performing the role that once kept you small. I resigned as Mrs. Trustee Chair before anyone could assign me that invisible title again. I kept my own name, my ministry, my accounts, and my right to question any system that asked vulnerable people to purchase help with silence. The check was preserved in the audit archive, not as evidence of Rochelle's shame, but as evidence of why procedure matters when compassion and power occupy the same room. James chapter 2 asks what good it is to speak warmly to someone in need without giving what the body requires. The church must help people materially, but help must remain help. It must not become surveillance. It must not become loyalty purchased in secret. It must not ask a woman to surrender her voice in exchange for keeping her lights on. Truth did not make me hard. It made my compassion more honest. Dignity was not refusing every hand extended toward me. Dignity was learning to recognize the difference between a hand that steadies and a hand that closes around your wrist. Faith did not require me to call control leadership or secrecy peace. God met me in the clear space where kindness no longer carried hidden terms. This space is for women who were taught to be grateful for help that quietly took something from them. If you have ever learned that a favor carried a price no one named, share only what feels safe in the comments. Another woman may need to hear that gratitude never cancels her right to truth.